Drugs are bad. We know this on a very basic level. We've been told to just say no. We've dared to keep our kids off drugs. And we know that our government has fought a war on drugs for decades. What some of us don't realize is that this has all been done before, in the 1920s. Only then the villain was alcohol, and the war was called Prohibition. Then as now, the cure may be actually worse than the disease. After all the years and countless dollars spent, drug use continues. The same way people continued to drink during Prohibition. Now let's explore some of the similarities between the casual drug user of today and the occasional drinker of the 1920s. One similarity between 20s era Prohibition and the Prohibition policies of today is the criminalization of common Americans. In 1921, after Prohibition took effect, the sale, possession, and consumption of alcohol became a criminal offense. This approach served not to eliminate alcohol, but rather turned common Americans into common criminals. The overall consumption of alcohol did not stop. In fact, according to newspeakdictionary.com, by 1925 there were over 100,000 speakeasies in New York alone. The sheer number of people flaunting the law made the law nearly impossible to enforce. And since the police and other officials were just as apt to partake in the activity as anybody else, corruption skyrocketed. Officials would either turn a blind eye or at worst took bribes in order to look the other way. Statistics show that this happens again today during the drug wars. Now let's look for a moment at the economic side of the war on drugs. According to theeconomist.com, the prohibition policies of today are a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry, the same as they were in the 1920s. The reason for this is simple. Just because something is illegal does not mean that it's not in demand. And as long as there's a demand, there will always be somebody there to fill that demand. In the 1920s, we had the mafia. Today, we have the drug cartels. And because it's so profitable, violent crime actually increases. In Chicago, for example, in 1921, there was a 24% increase in violent crime. In 1970, there was also a similar spike in criminal activity, arguably the beginning of the war on drugs. One last thing we should consider is whether these policies of prohibition are actually effective. According to Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, also known as LEAP, the rates of drug use and abuse today are nearly identical to 30 years ago. Even with the amount of dollars and time spent arresting and prosecuting drug users and dealers, for every dealer arrested, a new one rises to take his place. The demand never decreases, and criminal activity continues. While law enforcement spins its wheels and spends our dollars, people still use, still buy, and still sell. LEAP officers contend that a policy of prohibition rather than legalization and regulation actually leads to new and more potent drugs hitting the streets, causing an increase in overdoses. And since drug dealers are not limited to a specific rule of marketing, you've got an ever younger audience for drug use. Now, with all the similarities between the drug use policies of today and prohibition policies in the 1920s, can we actually say that prohibition for anything really works? Remember that all the things associated with the drug war today have been tried before. During Prohibition, Americans continued to drink, whether it was against the law or not. The same can be said of drug users today. During Prohibition, the mafia rose to incredible power and wealth due to selling alcohol to the general public. The same can be said of the drug cartels today. During Prohibition, people continued to drink, regardless of what the law said. The law was a failure which was eventually overturned and replaced with a policy of regulation and taxation, which has benefited every sector of our society since. The same could be true with a smarter system of regulation, legalization, and taxation of the drug wars.